When I originally conceived of this volume on studying Paul's letters, I imagined it to be the perfect companion for a course or a reading group. One can read and use about a chapter of this per week, for example. I think the book works great in this way, and one could certainly then use the book in such an orderly fashion, progressing through the chapters from front to back. Certainly we did put some time and energy and thought into the sequence of the chapters in this collection, so it works that way. Nevertheless, as I indicate in my introduction, this book could be productively used in a variety of ways, including varying the order of the readings and exercises for your own purposes. I do still recommend starting with at least most of my introduction, and then the historical approaches chapter. These foreground key matters of perspective and starting points. An historical chapter highlights some of the grounding assumptions of most scholarly ways of reading Paul's letters. So it's good to raise our own as well as the learner's awareness about these. But for further suggestions about how to use this book, check out the introduction, and you can see there's a final section in which I actually label a section called How to Use This Book. In terms of more explicit uses in learning context, one can directly build upon and interact with the structure of each of the contributions and of the whole book. One kind of differentiation you can make, for example, in teaching, is how much to use Pauline or other biblical texts, and which ones to use in and out of meetings. If wanting to say, for example, push the users of the text, one could even see combining the following suggestions sequentially in an overall curriculum over more than a few weeks, or even beyond one semester. So starting with those learners who need a bit more guidance, follow along with the analysis given in each entry, how the contributors apply the approach or give context to that text. That helps the learners to see that connection. So they didn't see, which part of the Pauline text do they direct that approach? Have them read that same Pauline text. Maybe it's about a chapter or so at a time. Have them maybe read the Pauline text first, then read this chapter in studying Paul's letters, and then go back to the same chapter and see how much their perspective has changed on it. Right? That can be very helpful, and again, it's rather explicit in helping them to see the connection that's made and what a difference this approach or perspective makes. For those who catch on more quickly or have more exposure or facility, assign them to apply what they're learning about the perspective or approach to a Pauline or another biblical text besides the one discussed in the chapter. This helps them to gauge, it helps us to see, how well they are connecting and doing this for themselves with the help of the learning community provided by your learning context as well as by the book. So can they do something parallel? Can they do something similar to what the final part of each chapter does, but with a different biblical text? Continuing on, for the more advanced or experienced of the learners, one could do a series of things with these chapters, including especially comparing the approaches that are taken to the same biblical text, the same bit of Pauline letters. So you can think about then the effects on the text and the effects of the approach on the way that you look at the text. Indeed, as I note in the introduction, some of our chapters already overlap in this fashion, discussing the same Pauline text, highlighting again what a difference in starting point, perspective, approach, or method makes. So you can assign such chapters in an intentional sequence. Reflect on what's different now, right? So I looked at this chapter and took this approach, and we looked at this kind of excerpt of Paul's letters, and now I've looked at another approach or perspective. And how does that change how I look at things, right? This time, this week, in comparison, how does it look differently now? Or assign them together for more direct and intensive conversation about the connections and differences. A slightly more difficult version of this is to have the users of this text apply the work of different chapters to one section of text not closely examined in this book. Or you could also parcel out the chapters and have the users report back in one meeting all the different perspectives at once. You spend the same time on a Pauline text, but you have different kind of students or groups of learners reporting back. Last of all, get the learners to reflect upon how they would combine, mix, or collaborate across or between multiple perspectives or approaches. Taking not one approach, or one and then the other, as I've just described, but think about when these combine or when you can incorporate insights from multiple entries together. And again, there are cues about this, a few of these potential intersections and common touchstones sprinkled throughout the chapters, but really the combinations are much wider and more variegated than these can note. For a more seminar-oriented course, one can extend and integrate much wider sets of connections by going beyond what is presented here, this time with the aid of the further reading lists provided in each chapter. These reading lists can supplement the readings, what's actually assigned. They can signal what are the initial possibilities for research for the learner's own writing projects. Or again, you can assign them as reports for individuals to read and present to your group or class. These activities enrich, expand, complicate, and even challenge what is being presented in this collection, which is exactly what we hope for, to launch people into these conversations and into their own learning activities. These chapters can't and don't present at all, and they really don't pretend to either, but we do present what we think are the most important and useful things for someone to know if you're using and understanding biblical materials. Over time, with more practice, the learners can make such critical uses of these materials their own analysis of a text, their own critically reflected upon perspective or approach, which then they can take, sure, to a Pauline or a biblical text, or really to any text, or as at least a couple of entries indicate, things besides texts. See the next video for more suggestions about learning activities connected to studying Paul's letters.